Julian lived in a world of vibrations. His workshop in the northern districts of London was a narrow, high-ceilinged sanctuary that smelled eternally of spirit varnish, pine resin, and the sharp, acidic tang of aged maple. To the outside world, the shop was a relic of a dying era, but to Julian, it was the only place where the world made sense. He was a luthier, a maker and restorer of violins, and he lived by the philosophy that wood never truly dies. It only waits for the right hands to make it speak again. Julian was 34, but he moved with a cautious economy of motion, usually reserved for the very old. He spoke very little because he spent his days listening to the tap tone of wood. He would hold a wedge of spruce cut from the north-facing side of a mountain in the Fiemme Valley to his ear and strike it with a knuckle. He was listening for a clear, bell-like ring, a frequency that promised a masterpiece. If the wood sounded thuddy or hollow, he would set it aside for firewood. He had no patience for mediocrity. His life was a series of measured intervals. He woke at 6, drank black coffee, and worked until the light failed. He had few friends and even fewer lovers. Most people found his silence unnerving, as if he were constantly judging the pitch of their voices. He wasn't judging, of course. He was simply searching for resonance. Then came Elena. She entered his shop on a Tuesday in November, a day when the London fog was so thick it seemed to press against the glass of his storefront like a living weight. The bell above the door gave a lonely, metallic chime. She didn't look like a musician. She wore a heavy, oversized wool coat that had seen too many winters, and boots caked with the salt of the city streets. But she carried a violin case that looked as though it had been pulled from a shipwreck. "I was told you were the only one who wouldn't laugh," she said. Her voice was low, with a slight tremor that wasn't from the cold. She placed the case on his velvet-lined workbench. When she opened it, Julian didn't laugh, but he did catch his breath. Inside was a violin in pieces. It wasn't just broken, it was shattered. The ribs were crushed as if by a heavy boot. The scroll was snapped clean from the neck, and the varnish was blistered and blackened by heat. Julian looked at the wreckage, then at Elena. Her eyes were a storm cloud gray, fierce and desperate. "It's a Guadagnini," Julian whispered, recognizing the unmistakable sweep of the F-holes even through the grime. 1770s, perhaps? Piacenza period? 1774, she corrected him. "It belonged to my grandfather, Marek. He played it in the orchestras of Warsaw before the world went dark. He used to say that as long as he had the violin, he had a home. When the city fell, he hid it under the floorboards of a bakery. When the bakery burned, he went back into the cellar to find it. He saved it, but he lost his hands to the fire. He never played again." She touched the blackened wood with a trembling finger. "He brought it to London in a crate of blankets. He kept it under his bed for 50 years, waiting for someone he could trust to fix it. He died last month. His last wish was to hear it sing one more time, even if it was through my hands." Julian looked at the wood. It was a tragedy in maple and spruce. To fix it would require more than skill. It would require an obsession. "It will take a year," Julian said. "The wood is traumatized. I have to bridge every crack with cleats thinner than a butterfly's wing. I have to find varnish that matches the original chemical composition of the 18th century. And even then, I cannot guarantee it will ever sing again. It might just be a beautiful, silent box. I have time, and I have the stories to tell it while you work. My grandfather believed that instruments need to be reminded of who they are."
For the first few months, Elena came to the shop every Friday afternoon. At first, Julian found her presence intrusive. He was a man of solitude, his life measured in millimeters and the shaving of wood thinner than a human hair. He liked his shop silent, save for the rhythmic scritch, scritch of his scrapers. But Elena didn't just watch. She brought a small thermos of tea and sat on a high stool in the corner. She began to tell him about Warsaw, not the war, but the music. She described the way the light fell in the concert halls, the smell of the sheet music, and the way her grandfather would close his eyes before the first note, as if he were catching a prayer. As Julian worked, he found himself listening to her as much as he listened to the wood. He began to prepare for her arrival. He bought a specific brand of Earl Grey tea she liked. He cleared a space on his workbench so she could sit near the heat of the small cast-iron stove. One afternoon, as he was meticulously cleaning the soot from the violin's scroll using a solution of distilled water and enzymes, he asked her a question. "Did you ever play?" Elena looked down at her hands. "I studied at the Royal College. I was good, not a prodigy, but good. But after my grandfather died, I couldn't pick up a bow. Everything felt hollow. I became a high school teacher. I teach children how to hold a violin, but I haven't held one for myself in years. I lost the spark, Julian. I'm just waiting for this instrument to tell me if it's still there." Julian paused. He picked up a small piece of aged spruce he had been carving. "I grew up in this shop," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "My father was a carpenter, a man who built houses. He taught me that if you respect the grain, the wood will tell you where it wants to go. But houses are stationary. They don't move. I wanted to build things that traveled. I've spent my life following the grain, but I never thought about who was walking behind me. I've been making instruments for ghosts." Elena stepped closer, the scent of her damp wool coat mixing with the pine resin. "Maybe we're both just trying to find a way to talk to people who aren't here anymore."
By the following spring, the Phoenix, as they had begun to call it, was starting to resemble an instrument again. Julian had rebuilt the internal structure, using tiny surgical clamps to pull the ribs back into their elegant, feminine curves. The intimacy of their Fridays had become the gravity of his week. He found himself thinking of Elena at odd hours, while he was at the grocer, while he was lying in bed listening to the rain. He began to notice the small things, the way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear when she was thinking, the way her voice lowered when she spoke of her mother's illness, and the way she looked at his hands when he worked. One evening, the heat in London was stifling. The shop was a hothouse of glue steam and sawdust. They moved to the tiny brick-walled courtyard behind the building. "What happens when it's done?" Elena asked, looking up at the narrow slice of sky between the rooftops. Julian felt a pang of sharp, cold fear. "You play it. You find your spark. You take it to a stage where it belongs." "And you go back to your silence?" Elena asked. Julian turned to her. In the dim light, he saw the smudge of graphite on her thumb and the way her eyes searched his face. He realized then that he didn't want the silence anymore. He had spent his life listening for the perfect tone, but the most beautiful sound he had ever heard was the way she said his name. "I don't think I can go back," Julian said. He reached out and touched her cheek. His hands were rough, calloused by years of manual labor, but he touched her as if she were the most fragile varnish he had ever applied. When he kissed her, it wasn't the tentative, careful movement of a craftsman. It was the desperate, hungry release of a man who had been holding his breath for 30 years. Elena pulled him closer, her hands knotted in his apron. In that moment, the tap tone of Julian's heart was no longer a solitary ring. It was a symphony.
But love, like the wood of a violin, is susceptible to the environment. It expands in the heat and contracts in the cold. In the late autumn, Elena received a phone call. Her mother's condition had worsened, and she had to move to the north of England to care for her. The Fridays stopped. The tea stayed in the cupboard. The shop, once a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. Julian tried to work, but his focus was gone. He was at the most critical stage, the varnishing.
The varnish of a Guadagnini is legendary, a deep, glowing amber that requires dozens of coats, each one dried in natural sunlight and sanded with horsetail grass. Without Elena, the light seemed wrong. He became obsessed with perfection, convinced that if he made the violin perfect enough, she would have to come back to claim it. He worked late into the nights, his eyes straining under the electric lamps. One night, exhausted and half-blind with fatigue, he applied a coat of oil varnish while the humidity was too high. The next morning, he found the instrument bloomed. A milky, opaque film had clouded the wood, obscuring the beautiful grain he had worked so hard to save. He sat at his bench and put his head in his hands. He felt a devastating sense of failure, not just as a luthier, but as a man. He had tried to force the wood to shine, just as he was trying to force his life to stay in one place. He sent a letter to Elena. "I ruined it," he wrote. "The wood has rejected me." 3 days later, a letter came back. It wasn't a long one. "Julian," it read, "the wood hasn't rejected you. It's just waiting for you to breathe. My grandfather's violin survived a fire and a war. It can survive a little cloudiness. Fix it because you love the music, not because you're afraid of the silence. I'm coming home soon. Wait for the sun." Julian read the letter until the ink began to fade from the oils of his skin. He took a deep breath, picked up his scraper, and began the agonizing process of stripping the ruined varnish back to the bare wood. It took 2 weeks of painstaking labor, but this time he didn't rush. He worked with the patience of a man who knew that time was not his enemy, but his medium. April arrived with a sudden, violent burst of blossoms in the London parks. The air was crisp and clear, the kind of light that Luthiers dream of. Julian was standing at his window, watching a sparrow on the sill, when the bell rang. Elena stood there. She looked tired, her coat a little more frayed than before, but her eyes were bright. She didn't say a word. She walked to the workbench. There, resting on a silk cloth, was the Guadagnini. It was no longer a blackened wreck. It was a masterpiece. The varnish was a deep, transparent gold that seemed to hold the sunlight inside the wood. The cracks were invisible, healed by Julian's steady hands. "Is it?" she started. "It's ready," Julian said. Elena picked up the instrument. She felt the weight of it, balanced, light, and alive. She took a bow from the rack, tightened the horsehair, and applied a bit of rosin. She tucked the violin under her chin and closed her eyes. She drew the bow across the G-string. The sound was massive. It wasn't the thin, bright sound of a modern instrument. It was a dark, chocolatey growl that vibrated through the floorboards and into Julian's chest. It was the sound of a century of grief being exhaled at once. Elena began to play. She played a Polish folk song her grandfather used to hum, a melody that skipped and wept and finally soared. As she played, the spark she thought she had lost didn't just return, it ignited. The shop was no longer a place of repairs, it was a concert hall. When she finished, the final note hung in the air for a long, shimmering moment before fading into the sound of the London traffic outside. Elena looked at Julian, tears streaming down her face. "You didn't just fix it," she whispered. "You gave it a soul." "No," Julian said, stepping toward her. "The soul was always there. I just had to clear away the ash so I could hear it." Years later, the shop in North London is still there, but the window display has changed. Alongside the violins and cellos are framed photographs of concerts and a small hand-painted sign that reads, "Julian and Elena, the mending of music." They never left the shop.
They realized that their love didn't need a grand stage or a perfect cloudless life. It needed the daily work of tuning, the patience of drying varnish, and the willingness to strip everything back when things went wrong. Elena still plays the Guadagnini. She plays it for her students, she plays it in the local quartets, and every Friday afternoon she plays it for Julian while he works. Julian still listens to the wood, but now, when he strikes a wedge of spruce and hears that clear bell-like ring, he doesn't just think of the instrument he's going to build. He thinks of the woman who taught him that even the most shattered things can be made whole again, provided you have enough resin, enough time, and someone to share the tea with. They learned that love isn't a finished piece of music. It's the practice. It's the scales, the calluses, the broken strings, and the constant, beautiful effort to stay in tune with another soul. The clock in the shop ticks away the seconds, but for Julian and Elena, time is no longer a countdown. It is a composition. And as the sun sets over the London rooftops, casting a golden glow over the wood and the strings, the music goes on, echoing through the halls of their lives, a resonance that started with a broken violin and ended with a love that finally, perfectly, rang true.
Thank you for giving your time. If you loved the story, then give a thumbs up, comment down your thoughts, and share with your friends. And one earnest request, please subscribe to the channel. Thank you again.